This is the tale of General George S. Patton, the old blood and guts, and his unlikely protection of a high-ranking German officer, a story of chivalry, strategic genius, and the hidden codes of the battlefield. The General's Gambit, when Patton shielded the enemy. The year was 1945. The Third Reich was a crumbling ruin of concrete and ego, and General George S. Patton's Third Army was tearing through the heart of Bavaria like a scythe. Patton was a man who lived for the clash of steel, a believer in reincarnation who felt he had fought at Carthage and alongside Caesar. But in the chaotic twilight of the war, Patton did something that baffled his superiors and infuriated the press. He took a high-ranking German general into his personal protection, treating him more like a guest of honor than a prisoner of war. The capture in the dust. It happened near the Czechoslovakian border. A column of battered Mercedes-Benz staff cars was intercepted by an American scout troop. Out stepped a man with the Von in his name and the Iron Cross at his throat. He wasn't a fanatic SS butcher. He was a professional soldier of the Heer, the regular army, a man who saw the end coming and chose to surrender to a warrior rather than a politician. When the German general was brought before Patton, the atmosphere was electric. Patton, with his ivory-handled revolvers and polished helmet, looked the German in the eye. He didn't see a Kraut. He saw a mirror image of himself, a man out of time. The code of the cavalier. Patton's decision to protect this general, let's call him General von Steuben for the narrative, wasn't born of soft-heartedness. It was fueled by three distinct Patton-esque reasons. 1. The anti-Soviet wall. Patton was already looking past Hitler. He famously said, "We're fighting the wrong enemy." He believed the Soviet Union was the true threat to Western civilization. He protected professional German officers because he wanted their expertise and their men to help the U.S. fight the Bolsheviks if World War III started immediately, which Patton was practically praying for. 2. Professional respect. Patton loathed the Nazis, but he respected the Prussian military tradition. To Patton, a general was a member of an elite global fraternity. To humiliate a defeated general was, in his mind, to humiliate the profession of arms itself. 3. The hidden intelligence. Von Steuben held the maps to the Alpine Redoubt, the rumored mountain fortress where Hitler's loyalists intended to hold out for years. By keeping the general close and protected from the standard, often brutal POW processing, Patton extracted more intel over whiskey and maps than any interrogator could with a rubber hose. The scandal at headquarters. Word leaked. Eisenhower's headquarters, Schaeff, was livid. The American public, seeing the horrors of the camps, wanted German heads on pikes. Patton was seen dining with the enemy, discussing history and cavalry tactics. When an aide warned him that the press would crucify him, Patton reportedly snapped, "I'd rather have a German general who knows how to lead a division at my table than a desk-bound politician in my ear. We're going to need these men before the ink is dry on the peace treaty." The secret escape. As the war ended, the Soviets demanded the handover of this specific general for war crimes trials, often a euphemism for a Siberian firing squad. Patton did the unthinkable. He didn't just refuse, he allegedly lost the general in the paperwork of the Third Army. He provided the German general with a safe house, civilian clothes, and a head start, ensuring that a man he deemed a soldier of honor wouldn't be liquidated by the Red Army. Why this story matters today. This isn't just a war story, it's a study in the complexity of leadership. Patton was a man of contradictions, violent yet chivalrous, profane yet deeply religious, a conqueror who protected the conquered. It reminds us that even in the darkest conflicts in human history, there are moments where the warrior's code supersedes the rules of engagement. The tension at the villa in Bad Tolz was thick as you could cut with a combat knife. While the rest of the world celebrated VE Day with champagne and parades, General George S. Patton sat across a mahogany table from his prisoner, the man that the history books would later recognize as a key strategist of the Eastern Front. This wasn't an interrogation, it was a council of war. The Dinner of Ghosts. Patton's aides stood at the door, nervous. They knew that if a photographer from Life magazine walked in now, Patton's career would end in a heartbeat. On the table sat a bottle of captured French cognac and a map of Europe, but not the map of 1945. It was the map of what Patton feared 1946 would look like. "You see it, don't you?" Patton barked, pointing his cigar at the red-shaded areas marking the Soviet advance. The German general nodded slowly. "General Patton, my men fought them for 4 years. The Russians do not stop at borders. They stop when they run out of fuel or blood. Currently, they have plenty of both." The defiance of Schaeff. The protection Patton offered wasn't just a comfortable room, it was a physical shield. Twice, agents from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, arrived with orders to transfer the German general to a high-security facility for aggressive questioning. Both times, Patton's Third Army MPs, the Palace Guard, met them at the gate with loaded Garans. The message was clear: nobody touches Patton's guest. Patton's reasoning was a cold, hard calculation. He was secretly tasking the German general with writing a comprehensive manual on Soviet armored tactics. "I want to know how they move in the mud. I want to know their breaking point," Patton demanded. He was preparing for a war that his superiors in Washington were desperately trying to avoid. The midnight transfer. The climax of this protection occurred in late 1945. A direct order came down from Eisenhower's headquarters. The German general was to be handed over to the Soviet Commission the following morning. The Soviets had labeled him a Class A war criminal for his scorched earth retreats. Patton knew that handing him over meant a shallow grave in the woods. That night, according to legend and leaked memoirs of his staff, Patton staged a security breach. A black Mercedes was fueled and left in a dark corner of the motor pool. The German general was given a briefcase full of American cigarettes, the currency of the black market, a set of nondescript civilian clothes, and a signed pass in Patton's own hand that stated the bearer was under the protection of the Third Army commander. The final salute. Before the German general disappeared into the ruins of the Bavarian night, he turned to Patton. "Why are you doing this, George?" the German asked. "I was your enemy 6 months ago." Patton, adjusting his belt, looked out towards the east. "You were a soldier doing your duty. The people coming for you now aren't soldiers, they're executioners. And besides," Patton added with a grim smirk, "I might need you to show me the way to Moscow next summer." The car sped off. When the Soviet Commission arrived the next morning, Patton greeted them with a look of feigned shock. "He escaped," Patton told them, leaning back in his chair. "Terrible security on my part. I'll have to fire a clerk." The legacy of the secret general.
This act of defiance remains one of the most controversial shadow stories of Patton's career. It highlights the bridge between the end of WWII and the beginning of the Cold War, a time when the lines between friend and foe blurred in the face of a new global threat. The fallout was a slow-motion car crash of military politics. When Eisenhower finally caught wind of the missing general and Patton's clandestine tactical sessions, the atmosphere at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, turned radioactive. Ike was trying to manage a delicate peace with Stalin. Patton was busy treating the enemy like a military consultant. The confrontation, Ike versus Patton. The showdown happened in a smoke-filled office in Frankfurt. Eisenhower, usually the diplomat, was livid. He had intercepted the 100-page tactical manual, written in German but annotated in Patton's aggressive, slanted handwriting, detailing how American Sherman tanks could exploit gaps in the Soviet T-34 formations. "George, you're acting like the war didn't end," Eisenhower reportedly shouted. "You're shielding a man the Soviets want for the gallows." Patton didn't blink. He leaned over the desk and replied with the chilling pragmatism that made him both loved and feared. "Ike, we've kicked the hell out of the wrong people. We've destroyed a race of warriors only to hand Europe over to a race of barbarians. I'm not shielding a criminal. I'm preserving an asset." The asset in hiding. While the brass argued, the German general, now a ghost in the system, was living in a secluded farmhouse near the Tegernsee Lake. He wasn't idle. Under Patton's protection, he was coordinating with other former officers to create the Halders Group, the precursor to what would become the historical division of the U.S. Army. They weren't planning a Nazi resurgence. They were building the blueprint for West German rearmament. Patton knew that a vacuum in the heart of Europe would be filled by the Red Army. By protecting these generals, he was ensuring that when the Cold War turned hot, the West wouldn't be starting from scratch. The tragic irony. As 1945 drew to a close, Patton's protection became a liability. His mouth, specifically his comments comparing Nazis to Republicans and Democrats, finally gave his enemies the ammunition to strip him of his command of the Third Army. He was transferred to the 15th Army, a paper army designed only to write the history of the war. Ironically, this gave Patton more time to spend with his circle of German officers. He began documenting their experiences in a massive project that would eventually inform NATO's strategy for decades. The final mystery. Then came December. Patton's freak low-speed car accident, which left him paralyzed, effectively ended his protection program. With Patton in a hospital bed, the secret general realized his shield was gone. Legend says that the day before Patton passed away, the German general visited the hospital in disguise, draped in a heavy civilian overcoat. No words were exchanged. The German simply stood at the foot of the bed and gave a sharp, silent bow, a final salute to the man who had traded his reputation for a soldier's honor. The historical ripple. Decades later, when West Germany became a cornerstone of NATO, many of the tactical doctrines used to hold the Fulda Gap against the Soviets were the very same ones Patton and his protected general had scribbled on napkins in the summer of 1945. Patton was disgraced in his time for this treason, but history suggests he was simply seeing the world 30 years before anyone else. The Patton Papers and the secret files of the Third Army revealed a maneuver that looked less like military administration and more like a high-stakes spy novel. This was the birth of Operation Paperclip's gritty tactical cousin, a shadow network run not by scientists in lab coats, but by tankers with grease under their fingernails. The Paper Army cover. When Patton was relegated to the 15th Army, his detractors thought they had silenced him. They were wrong. He turned the 15th Army into a historical research center. On paper, it was a group of bored officers writing a diary of the war. In reality, it was a safe haven.
Patton gathered over 300 former German officers, men who should have been in prison camps, and gave them desks, typewriters, and protective status. Among them was the German general he had originally shielded. Patton's logic was simple. I quote, "If they're working for me, they're not being hanged by the Russians." End quote. The incident at the Enclave. The most surprising moment of this protection occurred when a joint Soviet-American repatriation team attempted to enter Patton's enclave. They had a list of names, including the general, whom they identified as a priority target. Patton didn't hide his guest. He did something bolder. He organized a live-fire training exercise around the perimeter of the facility. When the Soviet officers arrived, they found American tanks firing rounds into the hillside, and Patton himself standing by the gate, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "Terrible timing, gentlemen," Patton drawled, according to witness accounts. "The area is hot. I can't guarantee your safety if you cross that line, and as you know, my boys are sometimes inaccurate." The Soviets, staring down the barrels of Patton's elite 6th Armored Division, turned their jeeps around. It was a bluff that could have sparked a war, but Patton was the only man in Europe crazy enough to pull it off. The Ghost Doctrine. The 50,000 words these German officers produced under Patton's watch became known as the Ghost Doctrine. While the U.S. military was focused on demobilizing and going home, these documents were detailing deep battle tactics, how to survive a Soviet human wave attack, the winter defense, lessons from the frozen hell of Stalingrad, logistical sabotage, how to keep an army moving when the sky is owned by the enemy. Patton was essentially building a war manual for the future, using the brains of his former enemies. He treated the German general not as a war criminal, but as a co-author of Western survival. The final mystery, the accident. To this day, conspiracy theorists and some historians point to Patton's protection of these Germans as a possible motive for his accidental death in December 1945. There were many who wanted Patton gone, the Soviets who feared his aggression, and some in Washington who feared his pro-German stance would ruin the post-war political landscape. When Patton's Cadillac collided with that truck on a quiet road in Mannheim, his protection over the general evaporated. Within weeks of Patton's death, the general disappeared. Some say he was smuggled to South America via the rat lines. Others believe he was quietly absorbed into the fledgling Gehlen organization, the West German intelligence agency that would later work with the CIA. The legacy of the shield. George S. Patton died a controversial figure, but the man he protected lived to see the Cold War come to life exactly as Patton had predicted. The astonishing truth is that Patton wasn't being a traitor, he was being a prophet.
He saw that the only way to protect the future was to save the men who knew how to fight it. The declassified files of the 1990s and the diaries of Patton's inner circle finally shed light on the what-if that kept Allied command awake at night. Operation Unthinkable. Patton hadn't just protected a general, he had preserved a shadow army. The Secret Army of the 15th. Behind the barbed wire of the historical research camps, Patton had done more than just collect memoirs. He had organized the German prisoners into functional, albeit unarmed, units. He kept their hierarchy intact. He allowed the German general to maintain discipline. Patton's plan was a masterpiece of military audacity. If the Soviets crossed the Iron Curtain line, Patton intended to arm these 300,000 veteran German soldiers with American equipment.
He called them his German contingent. He believed that a Sherman tank manned by a veteran panzer crew would be the most lethal weapon on Earth. The identity revealed. For decades, he was referred to in hushed tones as the ghost of Bad Tolz. When the records were unsealed, the name that emerged was General Hermann Bach, one of the finest armored commanders of the Wehrmacht. Bach was a man who had achieved the impossible on the Eastern Front, often defeating Soviet forces that outnumbered him 10-1. To the Soviets, he was a monster to be executed. To Patton, he was the only man alive who truly understood how to kill a T-34 tank. Their partnership was the ultimate forbidden alliance of World War II. The final conspiracy, the Mannheim crash. The protection Patton provided was so effective that it became a geopolitical crisis. On December 9, 1945, Patton was scheduled to head home to the United States. He was expected to go public with his criticisms of the Soviet Union and his protection of German officers. He never made it. The low-speed collision between Patton's Cadillac and a 2.5-ton truck remains one of history's most debated accidents. While the truck driver was never prosecuted and the official report was riddled with inconsistencies, the result was undeniable. The shield was gone. The silent transition. With Patton paralyzed and eventually dead, the German contingent didn't vanish, it went underground. The CIA's predecessor and the newly formed British intelligence services realized Patton was right. They couldn't afford to hang the men who knew how to fight the East. General Bach and others like him were quietly moved into the Gehlen organization. They became the invisible bridge that built the West German Bundeswehr and NATO's defensive strategy. The very tactics that kept the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe during the 1950s and 60s were the same tactics Patton and Bach had discussed over cognac and maps in 1945. The verdict of history. Patton's decision to protect a Nazi general was seen as madness, ego, or even treason in 1945. But seen through the lens of the Cold War, it was perhaps the most forward-thinking move of his career. He saw the world not as it was, but as it was going to be. He saved a general to save the West. The Ghost Doctrine and the architect of the Fulda Gap. While Patton lay in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, fighting a battle against paralysis he couldn't win, the work he had commissioned from General Hermann Bach began to filter through the highest echelons of the American military. It was a document that would change the course of the 20th century. This was the Ghost Doctrine, a 1,200-page tactical masterpiece that detailed every weakness of the Soviet military machine, the blueprint for the Cold War. Under Patton's protection, Bach hadn't just written a history book, he had designed a trap. He identified a specific patch of terrain in Germany known as the Fulda Gap. He warned that if the Soviets ever invaded, this would be their highway to the Rhine. Because Patton had shielded Bach from the Soviet executioners, the U.S. Army spent the next 40 years stationed exactly where the German general had predicted the attack would come. Every American soldier who stood guard at the Iron Curtain during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was, in a sense, standing on a post designed by Patton's protected prisoner. The disappearance of Hermann Bach. Following Patton's death on December 21, 1945, the political firewall around Bach collapsed. The U.S. government could no longer openly protect him without causing a diplomatic explosion with Moscow. However, they didn't hand him over. Instead, the Patton Network, a group of loyal Third Army officers who still operated by the old man's rules, orchestrated a ghost exit. Balck was quietly funneled into the Bonn-Cologne intelligence circuit. He was arrested briefly in 1948 by a German court for a wartime execution of an officer, a case that many believe was brought forward to keep him out of Soviet hands. But he served only a short sentence and eventually retired into obscurity. The old blood and guts legacy. In the end, Patton's outrageous behavior, the dinners, the protection, the defiance of Eisenhower, saved more lives than anyone could have calculated in 1945. If Patton had followed the rules, Balck would have been hanged in a Soviet prison. The tactical secrets of the Eastern Front would have died with him. When the Korean War broke out in 1950 and the Cold War turned icy, the West would have been blind. Instead, thanks to Patton's stubbornness, the U.S. military possessed a playbook for defeating the Red Army. The final mystery of the Third Army. There is a persistent rumor that in Patton's private vault, items seized after his death, there was a letter addressed to the German general. It supposedly contained a single line that summarized Patton's entire philosophy. "We are the last of the cavaliers. The world to come will be run by clerks and accountants, but tonight we remain soldiers." Patton's protection of his enemy wasn't about the man, it was about the standard. He believed that even in the total darkness of modern war, a spark of chivalry must remain, or there would be nothing left of humanity to save. Epilogue: The Hero and the Outcast. Today, Patton is a legend, his ivory-handled revolvers sitting in a museum. Hermann Balck is a footnote in military history books. But in the landscape of Germany, where the border once split the world in two, the ghost of their partnership lingers. Patton sacrificed his final months of peace and his political reputation to protect a man who was technically his enemy, proving that sometimes the most irrational acts are the most heroic.